All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, I cannot wait to have this conversation. We are joined by Barry Weisleder, who is a member of Socialist Action Canada and the NDP Socialist Caucus. And we are going to be talking about, we might be talking about a little bit of the history of anti-Semitism, the development of Zionism, and how in this day and age with the tragedy that is Palestine, how we mobilized and combated since despite the ongoing Holocaust and the tragedy we are seeing with Israel's live streaming genocide of the Palestinians, we are seeing daily action upon action, solidarity upon solidarity, and very interesting bridges being built between Congolese solidarity, Sudanese solidarity, Haitian solidarity, with Palestinian solidarity, and more we are seeing Jewish anti-Zionist voices saying loud and clearly, "Not in our name," and "never again" means never again for anyone, and that's why this is going to be a very fascinating conversation. But before we get into it, Barry, welcome back to the show, and it's an honor to have you back on the show.
Always a pleasure. Glad to be here with you, or to be here and you over there on the other side of the pond. But you know, happy to convey a message of solidarity and class struggle to you and your audience.
Likewise, but hey, here's hoping one day that I finally will. Well, actually, folks, donate to One Plus One, and if you donate enough to One Plus One, I can save up that money to move to Canada so I can be on the front lines of the people power movements there. But enough of that.
We'd love to have you there.
So, Barry, before we talk about
we'd love to have you here.
Likewise. Well, Barry, before we talk about Zionism and some of the skeletons, some of the skeletons that's in the closet of that political movement, I wanted to ask you, when we talk about anti-Semitism and the history of anti-Semitism, I myself, in preparing for this interview, have spent months reading upon, the different persecutions that the Jewish people faced, mostly in Europe and elsewhere. And I have to say, I mostly give my, teachers that I grew up with and who taught me all the different histories, I mostly give them, a B plus or an A plus when it comes to the history they've given me. But that being said, when reading about the persecution of the Jewish people, I was just so shocked at just like how much that often just gets left over, and we just sort of skip all the way to the Holocaust, and then we talk about the history of Israel. So before I ask my first official question, was that similar with you growing up? Unless you were, of course, amongst the community of Jewish people who will of course give the full history and not. I'm curious your response on that.
Well, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. My father and that side of the family dwelled in Poland, in a small town in a society which was marked by high levels of anti-Semitism. And when Germany invaded Poland, those who could escape, and many did not, escaped to the east into Russia and survived, with difficulty, the war years, and then came across Western Europe and to North America and settled in Toronto. So my mother's side of the family, they came. Well, my grandfather, mother's parent, was a refugee from World War I, and came to settle in Toronto eventually. So that's
and they were also Polish, or were they Russian?
Polish Jews, yeah. But they came, 20, 30, 40 years earlier, after following the displacement caused by the Holocaust. So the Jewish community was steeped in, um, the fight against bigotry, and was generally progressive and was generally anti-Zionist. It was only after, World War II, when the UN partitioned Palestine, which was previously under British mandate, partitioned Palestine into a Jewish state and Jordan. So that plus a lot of propaganda from Hollywood, the famous film The Exodus is an example, with Paul Newman in the starring role. Uh, there was a shift as American capitalism realized that the energy resources of the Middle East were extremely valuable and were coveted, and they needed to have in the Middle East region, which was in turmoil with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the crisis of French and British imperialism. They were very conscious of the partial political vacuum, and Israel could serve as a bastion of imperialist intervention in the region because of the oil resources. So the Zionist state, which was founded on the basis of a colonial settler project, which really got underway in the late years of the 19th century, the early years of the 20th century, and then really, laid deep roots as a colonial settler project in Palestine in the 1930s, organized the boycott of Arab labor. The Zionists said even to the Jewish shopkeepers, if you employ Arabs, they didn't call them Palestinians, if you employ Arabs or you have any commerce with the Arab world, we'll burn down your store. We'll inflict great pain upon you because we're setting out to create a new state, which would be a Jewish state, which would be exclusivist, based on the identity of an ethno-religious population, which they were avidly recruiting from Europe to transfer to Palestine. Well, that came to fruition in 47, 48, when the UN voted for the partition, and a large percentage of the formerly well-known Palestinian territory was usurped by the Zionist state, and a majority of the United Nations voted for it, including, disgustingly, the Soviet Union. Stalin voted for the creation of the Zionist state. And why? Because it was his hope that the Communist Party in Israel would be part of a coalition government. So they threw the Palestinians under the bus. Anyway,
but actually,
fast forward to the present day, you have a state which is deeply entrenched. It's the fifth largest military apparatus in the world, and it is engaged in a genocide now against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and has carried out a bombardment massacre across Lebanon. There's a ceasefire in place, but it has been violated hundreds of times by the Zionist state already, and it's just a few days old.
not only that, Syria has also been attacking the sovereign state of. I'm sorry. Israel has also been attacking the sovereign state of Syria for about as long as I remember, when the Western Gulf Turkish and Israeli efforts to overthrow the Ba'athist governments of Bashar al-Assad, when that basically failed, thankfully, the United States decided, and its allies, which includes Canada, Britain, and so forth, decided they would launch an economic terrorism against the Syrian government. So the usual economic terrorism and so forth. And Israel, since then had been bombing Syria, if not every day of the week, it seems as if every other day of the week. And now they're trying to do, it again, just as there's this fake ceasefire with Lebanon, who of course Israel has been, aggressing and so forth. It's just
let's not forget
unbelievable.
that Israel seized the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, and they have invaded Lebanon on several occasions. The current intervention being just the latest in a series. Um, and of course, they're trying to repossess, so to speak, Gaza, flatten it, and then build luxury condos in the northern part of it. That's the plan. And when Netanyahu appeared before the United Nations, well, just a few years ago, and showed a map of the Middle East, and there was no
Not much, yeah, a
no
few months ago
Palestine.
even, yeah.
No Palestine was evident. It's all about remaking the Middle East in the image of the Zionist state as a servant of U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable also what Israel gets away with. And but before we dig deeper into that, you know, let's talk first about about how once upon a time, Jewish people in what we now call modern day Europe were were the victims of institutional discrimination. But of course we're going to call it institutional anti-Semitism. And I know the Romans were probably the first imperialists who were cruel. Well, they weren't the first imperialists to be cruel to their subjects, but they were particularly cruel to boys. They had slaves. Women lived under very grotesque. Women were victims of very patriarchal subjects to the Romans. But what did the Jewish people experience under the Roman Empire? If you could, if you could share us. And I know there was a famous siege known as Mazada, where there was this huge war between the Romans and the Jewish people who they wanted to enslave and subjugate, and there was apparently a mass suicide. 900 something of the Jewish men, women, and children refused to be taken alive and then be slaves and so forth of the Roman Empire. I'm curious if you know anything about that, what you can share with us if you do know anything.
All I can tell you, not being an historian of ancient society, the Roman Empire encompassed many subject nations, and Palestine was one of them. And the Jews there were subjugated. They were force-fed the Roman gods and goddesses and the ideology of the Roman Empire. But they weren't alone in this. People all around the Mediterranean and even extending into Asia Minor were subjugated by the Romans until the Roman Empire, decayed and collapsed. They lost Britannia. They lost, to the Central and Northern Europe. The Roman Empire was classically overextended, and the Jews suffered. But the Jews were basically, the victims of many empires. They didn't cross into them; the empires crossed over them.
Yes, and then that's a perfect segue to this question, which is following the fall of both the Republic of Rome and the Roman Empire, we enter the ghastly, smelly, unhygienic Dark Ages known as the Middle Ages, where the where the Catholic Christian Church from Vatican City, Rome, reigned supreme. And of course, there was institutional anti-Semitism that existed then. But what was the rationale behind the both the casual anti-Semitism? So when people would and when I mean casual, people who say just bigoted stuff towards Jewish people, and then the institutional anti-Semitism, which is the discrimination, the kind of apartheid-like laws that Jews were subjugated to. I'm curious your
Well,
response.
it has everything to do with Christianity, which of course was the successor to the Roman Empire. The decline of the Roman Empire gave rise to fragmentation of the empire. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Christian Church in the West, uh, it came to be uh, originally a slave ideology. It came to be the ruling class ideology. And Charlemagne crowned himself the Holy Roman Empire, and Jews were depicted as Christ killers. Um, Even such tall tales as the manufacture of matzah, which is the unleavened bread utilized during Passover, was supposedly made from Christian blood. Such absurdities passed as truth and were celebrated by the rulers in order to justify their domination of others. And as long as you keep an oppressed people or an oppressed set of nations divided against one another, the empire rules. And then the new empire, the whole Roman Catholic Church, was built in part on the basis of Jew hatred.
And all, and so one of the rationales behind the persecution of Jewish people is basically Christian supremacy. But so the idea that because and I think this and I don't know if this well I think this it actually explicitly does say this in the New Testament. So because the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah and so forth like that, and because Jesus was later crucified by the Romans, murdered by the Romans and so forth, but even though he comes back from the heavens and so forth, Christian churches, whether it's the Vatican Church, whether it's evangelical churches, or any kind of Christian church, and even if the preachers might be very nice, swell guys, and they might even have messages of social justice, do they all follow a lot? Did a lot of them follow the line that Jews were to blame for the demise of Jesus, and ergo they had a lot of they preached a lot of anti-Semitism as well as just harbored a lot of anti-Semitic views.
Yeah, that's right. And the Jews had to atone collectively for the death of Jesus. He was nailed to the cross by Romans, not by Jews. um, but anyway, it's not really certain. There's no anthropological evidence to prove that Jesus ever lived. But the legend traveled far and wide, and on its foundation, a church was built. And with the collapse of the secular power, it gained traction, and served the purpose of a new authority at the center in Rome.
And can you talk to us about the influence? Can you talk to us about the influence of the leader of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther from Germany, who, while he was depicted in my sixth grade class in later years as a great liberal leader and challenger to the corrupt leadership of Catholicism, he actually has quite a lot of skeletons in his closet, one of them being his anti Semitism. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about one of his major dark side, which was his raging, vile anti-Semitism, and how that influenced major attitudes of European Christians to be even more violently bigoted to Jewish people.
I'm going to disappoint you. I don't have a lot to say about that subject, but I can tell you that the Protestant Reformation, which was headed, by him, corresponded to the rise of capitalism, the promotion of individualism and enterprise and private ownership was very much at the heart of the Protestant Reformation. It replaced the idolatry of Jesus with the idolatry of the mighty dollar, or whatever the currency was known as, by which it was known in that time and place. So it was all about an ethic of individual accumulation and profit. That was at the heart of the Reformation. But it caused splits. That Henry VIII split from the Holy Roman Church because ostensibly he wasn't allowed to divorce and remarry, but it was really in tune with the change in the mode of production.
Interesting. And during the Renaissance period, followed by the Dark Ages, aka the Middle Ages, in city-states like Vienna and Munich and elsewhere, the very first ghettos were built specifically to segregate the Jewish people, and later versions would be, would be used. And before I ask you to respond to this, let me just give an example of of what it was like. This is from uh, this is a historical notes from the very famous Shakespeare play, The Merchant of Venice, which is set in 16th century Venice, and it says the following in the beginning of the film version with Al Pacino and Jeremy Irons. Jeremy Irons. Intolerance of the Jews was a fact of 16th century life, even in Venice, the most powerful and liberal city-state in Europe. By law, the Jews were forced to live in the old walled foundry or ghetto area of the city. After sundown, the gate was locked and guarded by Christians. In the daytime, any man leaving the ghetto had to wear a red hat to mark him as a Jew. The Jews were forbidden to own property. Thus, they practiced usury, the practice of lending money at interest. This was against Christian law. The sophisticated Venetians would turn a blind eye to it but for the religious fanatics who hated Jews, it was another matter. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit more about that, or any knowledge you can share about the kind of economic apartheid that Jewish people had to live under.
Well, in that epoch, under that mode of production, agriculture was absolutely central, and Jews were not allowed to own property. Therefore, they couldn't be farmers. So they were not only confined to the inner city, so to speak, but they became traders. They traded in goods and in money, because they were excluded from the other occupations, crafts, and possessions, except in the most marginal ways. Uh, that was very much a form of economic apartheid, and Zionism just reverses that. It excludes the Palestinians and Arab people from land ownership in Israel, which is one of the basic laws at the foundation, or shortly following the foundation of the state. Most of the land in Israel, over 80% of it, is owned by the Jewish National Fund, but also contractors and other development authority and the state are the triangle of land ownership and control. Arabs are not allowed to buy land, and not allowed to own very much of anything, and even the houses that they own
But
can be
Barry,
demolished.
is it safe to say were a lot of those apartheid laws that that Zionists made the indigenous Palestinians? These are Palestinians who could be Muslims. These are Palestinians who could be secular. These are Palestinians that could be Christians and whatnot. Were a lot of those laws ironically influenced by the very same kind of apartheid laws that those Jews suffered under in Europe and in Russia and whatnot?
Well, I don't know if they were directly inspired by those laws under which Jews suffered, but they are certainly in keeping with and consistent with discriminatory laws that have existed around the world. The Chinese who populated Malaysia and Singapore, they also faced property law restrictions. So Jews are not the only ones to suffer from bigotry and economic apartheid, to say nothing about South Africa. Uh, you know, uh, this is all too common in human history under various forms of class society enforced by the capitalist state. So, well, we can't blame anti-Semites for everything. the Zionists are, basically anti-Semitic in the sense that they discriminate against the Palestinian Semites in a way that their predecessors suffered in Europe and elsewhere.
Well, that's a perfect segue into this question, which is talk to us about Imperial Russia. Now, the Tsarist, Tsarist Russia, which was an absolute monarch that practiced a feudal system, like that of the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church and aristocracy ran supreme over their subjects. It could have been the farmers or whomever. It was a very brutal system, like the Ancien regime of France. Can you talk to us about the various ways Jews were subjected to forms of, again, what we would call economic apartheid or Jim Crow, and then with that, talk to us about the grotesque phenomena that was the pogroms.
Jews were confined to residency in the Pale of Settlement, a portion of Russia in its western regions. They were again not allowed to, farm to any substantial degree. They were confined to certain crafts and professions, like again, money lending, and from time to time, when the regime was in trouble, it would delve into the cesspool of anti-Semitic bigotry, and once again present the fairy tales about blood, the use of the blood of Christians to make certain foodstuffs, and again saddling Jews for the direct responsibility for the death of Jesus, if he existed, and this was not countered by the church. The flames were fanned by the Catholic and Christian hierarchy. So this was certainly true in Russia. But the irony of it is that when Theodor Herzl and a small number of founders of the Zionist project went to the heads of state in Europe, even to the Tsar's court, and asked for assistance in establishing a Jewish homeland far away from Russia, they found some favor, they got some support, and the outcome of that was the establishment of a sectarian state with the help of anti-Semites. It's also a matter of record that that Jews who were part of the Zionist movement, which was a minority movement up until World War II. I said that earlier. I reiterate. Jews were basically very progressive. The most active segments were members of the Bolshevik Party or the Menshevik Party or the Bund, the Jewish Bund, which was strongly anti-Zionist. The Jews who helped to facilitate the Zionist project carried out the institution of an economic and eventually a political military apartheid in the Middle East. It's shameful. Rudolf Kastner and Adolf Eichmann in Hungary collaborated one with the other. The deal was, we will protect and facilitate the exit of the sort of Jewish nobility, the rich, 500 or 600 or 700 people from Budapest, and the rest would be confined to cattle cars and death in the concentration camps. When Rudolf Kastner was encountered by Jews who recognized him when he walked the streets of Tel Aviv, he was assassinated in Israel for his perfidious deeds in Hungary when the Third Reich took power there.
Unbelievable. And when we talk about pogroms, did they only did pogroms only which were basically violent stampedes, violent racist mob stampedes, anti-Semitic stampedes against the Jewish people. Now, did that only come when there was when there were certain problems that was developing in that frail system of Russian capitalism, Russian Tsarist capitalism, and so forth, and then
Feudalism.
yeah, feudalism. So did it only come when there was periods of extreme crisis in which the powers to be, of course, needed their favorite scapegoat, the Jews, to come about, and that's when these violent
There was a
mobs of
there was a strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism that lasted well forever. But of course, when it reached a high pitch, it usually coincided with some kind of social political crisis. But the Tsar established the Black Hundreds. These were armed horsemen who savaged, uh, uh, conducted barbaric raids into Jewish towns and villages, and were reviled, by anyone who had an ounce of decency. So this was the lot to Jews, and but the response was basically we have to change society. We have to defeat the fascist. They weren't called fascists at the time. We had to defeat the bigoting scum, the Black Hundreds, the pogromists, who against whom the church would simply wink. Uh, we have to change society, and that meant being part of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, later known as the Bolshevik Party. The minority was the Mensheviks. They had a stages concept. The Russians were for permanent revolution, and they knew that the Jews would be a hard and reliable ally because they were fighting for survival against outrageous reactionary storms that were unleashed by the state and by the church.
I was wondering then if you could talk to us about your own family's experience, that of your great grandparents and grandparents when it comes to institutional anti-Semitism in places like now they're from Poland originally, or were they Ukrainian immigrants that later assimilated into Poland? Or
Well,
talk to us about
both sides of my family background are Jews in Poland,
okay.
and I don't have any direct experience of that. I came later, but there were stories about Jew hatred, and frequently related to us, at the Passover
Specifically to
table.
Poland, though.
Yeah, specific to Poland. Yeah.
Okay, can you please share with us some of those stories of institutional anti-Semitism?
Well, I've said it already several times in this interview, so I really don't have much to add.
Anything where you want to share them?
Well, I just repeat what I said earlier. There was ghettoization, there was economic apartheid, there was blatant anti-Semitism, uh, and even I was told, for example, you want a story, so I was told that even in sports, there would be a soccer team in the town or village, and one team would be Jews, and the others would be from other parts of the community, and you know there was not much of a non-sectarian sport spirit in the realm. So segregation went from the town to the school to the sporting field to the marketplace. It was everywhere, and I'm sure it was quite reprehensible and nauseating. But that old society was crushed with the crisis of feudalism, capitalism, and revolution. Poland, was occupied, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was occupied by Russia. Poland went back and forth between the great powers. Um, Polish independence was something that was championed by the West. But for example, Rosa Luxemburg was very dubious of Polish nationalism because of its links to anti-Semitism.
Mm.
And so she argued against national rights because she saw it as being primarily uh, regressive. Um, uh, as a Marxist, I do stand up for national self-determination, but not for imperialist countries, but for the imperialized, for those who are subjected to imperial rule from afar. That's that's a distinction that we make in the modern world. Marxists do make that distinction between the nationalism of the oppressed and the nationalism of the oppressors. But Lenin had a polemic with Rosa Luxemburg over this issue of Polish self-determination. Of course, Lenin was an internationalist. He was not a nationalist at all. But the question is, should the Polish people be able to uh, um, decide their own future collectively? And the answer for Lenin and the revolutionary Marxists of 120 years ago was yes.
This question, which is when we talk about, when we talk about, pogroms, and there were photos of these hideous attacks on Jewish people. But yet at the same time, if we talk about the United States, if we talk about Britain, if we talk about Canada, we talk about other places like Australia, New Zealand, and even France, and so much of Western Europe, there was quite a lot of bigoted anti-Semites there, and I think it was not uncommon for Jews to constantly be denigrated in in the South Parks of its times back then. So I have to ask this question, which is, what was the response of the international press, mainly in the Western world, when the hideous acts of depraved, grotesque racism was being inflicted on Jewish people, and what was the response of the global left to the pogroms and other stories of economic apartheid that Jewish people suffered under?
Well, the radical left came to the defense of the victims, and the establishment press, you know, uh, covered it minimally. Uh, they didn't champion the cause. Uh, there were still signs that no dogs or Jews allowed in this park. Uh, there were instances of bigotry even in civil life. It wasn't just the water fountains in South Africa that said for blacks and for whites separately. Jews were also derogated and despised by official society, even among the elite. There were separate clubs and institutions. Um, in Toronto, there was a club for the for the patriarchal corporate elite, for the Gentiles, and a separate one for Jewish business folk. So that this was pretty widespread, but it was only through struggles against discrimination that it was fought. And I must say, in the 1950s and 60s, the Black liberation movement, civil rights movement, and Jews were strong allies. The Jews marched with Dr. Martin Luther King and many others, and it was because they made common cause against an often indifferent corporate press and even society. So when did that come apart? Well, it came apart to a certain significant degree over the establishment of a colonial settler state in Palestine, the theft of Palestinian land, Israel as a beachhead for Western imperialism in the Middle East. That's when it started to come apart. And Jews would drift over to the Republican Party. Not that the Democrats were any much better, and they would gravitate more and more towards the conservative right, and they forgot their roots in the fight against bigotry.
In fact, you sort of alluded to this in some of your previous answers. But what was this about? But can you talk to us a bit more about what was this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory called blood libel, and then with that, talk to us about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory and the protocols of Zionism that led business tycoons, CEOs like Henry Ford, who believed so strongly in this that they helped Nazi Germany in their military mobilization efforts, and even secretly afterwards, despite the US being at war with Nazi Germany and putting sanctions on them, fascist Italy and Japan.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fake document that was promoted and propagated by the far right, that asserted that there is a Jewish conspiracy to take control of Christian society, to take control of the world, and that it rested on a combination of communists to undermine private ownership and Jewish capitalists who would exercise the levers of power behind the curtain, in the realm of high finance. So, if you were a populist, if you were a reactionary, thick-headed racist, you could believe both sides of the story simultaneously. And there's, of course, there are people today who believe the contradictory things that one President Trump, reelected, has to say. And that is, well, they're trying to undermine us from the right and from the left. It's just, a contradiction that defies any kind of rational thinking, but nonetheless, it's aimed at a certain kind of person who has been destroyed by capitalist crisis. Fascism is a petty bourgeois reaction. It's a mass movement of petty bourgeois reaction, people who are ruined by a system in crisis. The present, affordability problem, so-called, is feeding this frenzy. People with very poor historical understanding are looking for a scapegoat, and they can accept, some of them anyway. I mean, not just a few hundred people, but potentially millions can blame the scapegoats. Presently more to blame because the state of Israel is cherished by the right-wing conservatives, but more to be blamed are immigrants. And where are these immigrants coming from? They're coming from the poor countries. And why are they coming? They're not tourists. They're coming because they've been driven from home by famine, by floods, by heat waves of agriculture destroying climate change, and by war, the permanent wars that rage across Northeast Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. is trying to start a war with China. So these are the things, the phenomena that plague our societies, and that we have to do more than just guard against them. We need to extirpate them at the roots. And that means building revolutionary parties that are dedicated to workers' unity, internationalism, rank and file democracy, and public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. And that's, what Socialist Action fights to achieve. That's what our allies in the NDP Socialist Caucus, the Municipal Socialist Alliance, the Workers' Action Movement, campaigns for raising the minimum wage, indigenous rights, eco-socialism, breaking away from, reliance on carbon, fossil fuel, ending the wars, the permanent wars. When Trump is, threatens Canada and Mexico unless they solve the problem of migration and drugs.
Yeah.
Uh, he says if you don't do it, we'll impose a 50% or no, sorry, a 25% tax on all goods crossing the border into the United States from Mexico and from Canada, and that could have a devastating impact not only on Canadian auto producers and farmers and manufacturers of other things, but also on Americans who buy these things and who need parts and who also need Canadian natural resources, oil, gas, aluminum, in order to manufacture the things that are still manufactured south of the border, south
But
of the 49th parallel.
but Barry, this whole thing about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theories that that the Nazi Party and far right reactionary movements champions. Okay, just for the sake of argument, let's say that there are many Jewish people who are Bolsheviks, who are communists, who do
I wish.
who do want to.
There's at least one that I know, but no, there's many. But
Well,
in
just
fact,
for the sake of
independent.
argument, let's say that there is that there are many Jewish people who are Bolsheviks who do want to eradicate capitalism, blah 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 blah, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But for me, given though all of the different forms of apartheid though that Jews lived under, first under the Romans and then under the Catholic Church and then under Lutherans and Protestants and whatever was the Christianity of of a certain place, including Czarist Russia. That's the Orthodox Russian Church and their different versions and different languages. If you're going to discriminate, dispossess a group of people and say to them certain things like you can only fully be assimilated in our society if you absolutely eradicate your Judaism. I mean, for me, I would just say like, well, if a lot of Jews are are attracted to Marxism, since it's all positivity, they see it's all about seeing us as one and working better to build a better world. I mean, in other words, why couldn't they just have been like nicer to the Jews as opposed to this finding?
Yuri, can we take a little pause because I have someone beating down my door.
Sure, no problem. Okay, we're back on 1+1, continuing our conversation about the history of institutional anti-Semitism and Zionism. So, Barry, so briefly respond to this because you have an emergency to tend to. So briefly respond to this. I mean, this whole idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. I mean, like, if you're going to be discriminating against people, don't be surprised if they're going to mean to be attracted to things like Bolshevism, communism, or socialism, where
Well,
we're
exactly
as one. So I'm curious your response to that.
Well, it's not exactly if people who are oppressed have a tendency to combat their oppression. That's not news. And if they're wise, they know that the oppression goes deep into the profit system. They have to attack it at its source. And in order to win, especially if you're a minority, like Jews are a minority everywhere except in Israel, and even there it's an artificial majority as a result of ethnic cleansing. But if you're a minority everywhere, what's the first thing you learn? You have to make alliances with other people. And who are they going to be? Rich people? The merchants and the big bankers and the industrialists? Well, not bloody likely, because to the extent that your people are represented at all in the upper echelons of corporate capitalism, they've chosen to be allied to the cause of the problem, not the solution to the problem. So you have to find allies among the poor and the oppressed and the differently able and those who suffer gender discrimination and trans discrimination and sexism, as well as those who suffer, the subordination of their language and culture. this new nation state law that was enacted in Israel against the Palestinians, against the Arabs in July 2018 is pretty crafty. It says that Hebrew is the only language that Israel is defined as a Jewish state, and not a state for all the people who live in it, but for Jews. And it is Hebrew is the uh, uh, state-sanctioned dominant language. Arabic is not mentioned, and it reinforces 65 other Israeli laws that discriminate against Palestinian citizens in Israel and Palestinian residents of the occupied Palestinian territories, according to Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. So, people have to make alliances with those who are fighting. But it's sad to say, I have to admit, it's very sad that, according to the latest opinion polls, something like 70% of Jewish Israelis support the occupation and the bombardment of Gaza. In other words, they're accomplices of the genocide, and it's very, very disgusting and disturbing that is the case. But
But
the solution to that is to turn off the golden spigot.
and
Israel is an artificial society that is fostered in the Middle East by the super rich in the Western among the Western powers.
that's a perfect
You
base.
turn that off, and the sentiments of the Israeli population, the Jewish population, will shift.
But that's a perfect segue to my second to last question, which is tell us about Zionism and how. I mean, you've already. I mean, throughout the interview, you've given us different moments, of the greatest hits of Zionism and its bigotry. But tell us a bit more about Zionism and how, contrary to the popular stories, which are myths, explain how Zionism, Judeo-Zionism, how it wasn't this noble movement where if all Jews got together and lived in historic Palestine, now Israel, and made it a Jewish only country, all will be hunky dory. Talk to us about how actually Theodore Herzl harbored a lot of bigotry. He wrote about his bigotry, and other skeletons in the closet Zionists wouldn't want us knowing, or whistleblowers blowing the whistle on, including when I was very disturbed when you gave a presentation to Socialist Action Canada, an emergency, meeting when the genocide was occurring, and you talked a lot in your presentation about different Zionist leaders and their collaborations with Nazi Germany and other fascists that saw the demise of their people. So yes, your response to that.
Well, Israel, the Zionist state, is founded on a number of lies. One of which is it's a land without people, or a people without land. Israel has been occupied consistently and consecutively for millennia by the Arab peoples, the Palestinian peoples. So that's one of the lies, and that is Zionism is the moral agency of the victims of the Jewish Holocaust. But the fact is, and I mentioned this before, the Zionist movement collaborated with the Nazis in Europe. Not only did Herzl go to the Tsar and also to the other leading reactionaries to seek financial support for the Zionist project, but during the nightmare of Nazi rule, Adolf Eichmann and Rudolf Kastner in Hungary made a pact. I mentioned this earlier, that the Jewish nobility, so to speak, would be given safe passage out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the rest of the Jews would be marshaled, including by the Zionists, onto cattle cars, to roll on to their destruction in the extermination camps. So that was one of the examples, and it has lived to this day because Rudolf Kastner became an Israeli citizen, and when he was spotted by victims that he helped to destroy their families, he was assassinated in the streets of Israel by those who recognized the horrendous acts for which that he had committed. But the main thing is that the Jews have been progressive for most of their multi-century existence around the world, and they will be once again, taking on that responsibility. But I'm very pleased to say that just yesterday, in one of the buildings on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, over 100 members of Independent Jewish Voices occupied a building which houses the offices for many members of Parliament. And they said, ceasefire now, end the occupation, stop the genocide, no arms trade, both ways, between Canada and Israel, the Zionist state. So this is a return to progressive deeds and mass movement building in aid of human liberation. And I'm glad I lived to see it.
Last question I have to ask is the following. How do you respond to Zionists and their supporters when they say the following? And I have to admit, the arguments are pretty good. I mean, I don't believe them. I think they're BS, but they're very powerful arguments when they say the following. The Jewish people are the indigenous people on historic Palestine and modern-day Israel, and they'll use Judaism as being the oldest theology as an argument. They'll argue that the Islamic world, led by Muhammad, and the real-life Ottoman Empire and the real-life Moors displaced Jews from their historic homes, and even if Jews did flee persecution, they'll mention the Spanish Inquisition or something, and even if they did live in the Ottoman Empire, and even if they did live in historic Palestine, they always were second-class citizens and whatnot. Ergo, they have the right, as Israelis and their forefathers, to return to historic Palestine, modern-day Israel, and displace their once-upon-a-time would-be colonizers and whatnot. So I'm curious.
The right to return, I would consent to that, but the right to displace another people, what harm did the Palestinians or the Arabs writ large do to the Jewish people anywhere? Why would you saddle the Palestinians with crimes committed by imperialism and not committed by the Arab peoples? This is a great injustice, and it only serves to facilitate a state which is hated by all of its neighbors. Israel was supposed to be a solution to the Jewish question. Instead, it's a lightning rod for anti-Semitism. It's saying to Muslims from Indonesia to Northwest Africa and beyond, these people are oppressing your kin or your co-religionists. So the problem I have is with displacement. If Jews are persuaded by a book of stories called the Bible that says that they have a continuous presence or a continuous entitlement to living in historic Palestine, where they can admire the artifacts of a long lost civilization, well, fine. Let them visit, conduct pilgrimages, settle down. The relationship between Arabs and Jews from Europe was just fine, even as the Zionist project was taking root in the establishment of colonies. It was fine. There were no pogroms against the Jews by Arabs. It was only after the partition. Well, no, it was after the general strike by Palestinians, which was a strike against the Arab labor boycott. Jews were told, you shall not employ Arab laborers, you shall not have commerce with Arab merchants, otherwise we will destroy you. That's what the Zionists said. So they enforced that. Boycott, the predecessor to apartheid, rigidly, and that instilled the beginnings of antagonism. Antagonism is not in the genetic code of the human species. It is something that results from economic pressure and from great crimes committed against the people by others, who are hoodwinked by their rich rulers to do the misdeeds, to foster division, and to keep the minority in control of a divided majority. That's where hatred comes from, and it has to be combated, through acts of solidarity. And sometimes it has to be combated even employing violence against those who introduced violence into the equation. And as Malcolm X famously said, by any means necessary, oppression must be uprooted, utterly extirpated from the soil. So we make common cause with the Palestinians today, and when the golden spigot is turned off and the US rulers stop investing billions and billions of dollars in weaponry and surveillance technology and much more, making Israel, its military bastion in the oil-rich Middle East, then we will see a renaissance of human solidarity that will be exhibited, and it will be exhibited first and foremost by those who fight shoulder to shoulder against oppression. And that's why I cited the event that took place yesterday in Ottawa. I cite the worldwide international solidarity movement with the people, with the Palestinian people, with the campaign against the modern day Holocaust, the genocide now unfolding, which the International Court of Justice saw fit to identify. And that was the first ruling by the High Court against any pro-Western power. That court has been around for like decades, and it has never made a ruling against a Western power. And we, of course, include Israel as a Western power in the Middle East. So this is not like it's a radical court that has always been leaning in a certain direction and is now predictably coming to the aid of a people who are suffering genocide. No, it has been usually on the other side, savaging the poor, underdeveloped countries, but now for the first time, championing the obvious need for liberation by a people suffering genocide in real time. So there's good reason to be optimistic.
Barry, before I close this interview, any messages you want to share to somebody who is Jewish, but comes from a Zionist background, either in the West or they may even come from Israel, and they feel scared to speak out against what Israel is doing and against this political movement of Zionism? Any messages you want to give to those who might want to speak out, but they're fearful, and ergo they engage in self-censorship and whatnot?
Yeah, well, my word to them is take heart. Take heart, because you are not alone. When I grew up in North York, some 70 years ago, it was the only narrative on the street and in the media was pro-Zionist. It was the only narrative. But when I saw that Israel was one of the few countries that supported the US war in Vietnam, something twigged. What's wrong with this picture? It doesn't make sense. I investigated. So, folks, if you're in this position, don't be silent. Investigate and join organizations like Independent Jewish Voices and Jews Against Apartheid. There's a video, highly acclaimed video called Israelism. And it's about the new generation of young Jews in the United States, particularly, US and Canada, but in the US particularly, who are turning against the Zionist mythology. Watch that video, Israelism. And I'm going to recommend a book. Yeah, it's written by a Palestinian. I hope the The
Yep, you
Zionists
can
are
see it
still.
perfectly, and yep. Mhm.
It's written by a Palestinian, but he's not a Marxist. He's simply telling the story of how the settler state was established with the Western aid, and how bigotry was indoctrinated, was infused into the situation by the Zionists and their backers. And if there ever was a conspiracy to defraud a people of their land and culture, it's the Zionist state. So, um, folks, take heart. You're not alone, and history is increasingly on our side. It took a long time for me to enjoy seeing it as we do now, but you will see more and more of it. Make common cause with the fight for justice, democracy, and socialism. They go hand in hand. That's my word to those who are watching and listening to this show.
BDS now and democratic secular one-state solution now. It is the only game in town. Power to the people. Death to Western imperialism, settler colonialism, and Zionism. Well, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Barry Weisleder of Socialist Action Canada and the NDP Socialist Caucus. Barry, thank you so much for taking the time. And I don't know if I'm late or not, but happy Hanukkah. It's or
My best wishes to everyone for a better 2025, and thank you so much.
happy
It's always a
Hanukkah to
pleasure speaking
everyone.
with you, Youri.
Happy
Best wishes
Hanukkah
to
to
all.
everyone. Happy holidays to everyone. And Barry, keep up the great work and looking forward to speaking to you again in the very near future.
Solidarity forever.